The first questions. A September 12, 2001 email circulated to top EPA officials stated, quote, all statements to the media should be cleared through the National Security Council before they were released, close quote. So as early as September 12th, the National Security Council in the White House was approving public statements. Let's take a look at some of those statements. There'll be a video for about 30 seconds.
Right now, we're not getting any elevated levels that indicate concern. We have monitored in Brooklyn. We are monitoring within a 10-block area, a 10 blocks of this area, and again, the levels are all well below any indication of a health risk. You know asbestos was in there, is in those buildings, lead is in those buildings. There are the VOCs. However, the concentrations are such that they don't pose a health hazard. We're going to make sure everybody's safe. Well, if there's any good news out of all this, it's that everything we've tested for, which includes asbestos, lead, and VOCs, have been below any level of concern for the general public health.
Ms. Whitman, an EPA press release from September 18th also quotes you as saying, quote, I am glad to reassure the people of New York and Washington, D.C. that their air is safe to breathe. Mr. Henshaw, in a September 16th press release, you are quoted as saying, our tests show that it is safe for New Yorkers to go back to work in New York's financial district. In a series of EPA press releases beginning on September 13th, the following words were used to describe the air conditions. Good news, causes no concern, not detectable, no significant health risk, and safe to breathe. Ms. Whitman, do these words and phrases convey a sense of danger or even of caution, or do they in fact convey a sense of safety and security?
Mr. Chairman, those words, to the best of my recollection and every effort that I made at the time, were also added with the phrase, however, on the pile, it is different.
Well, we'll get to that.
But there's a significant difference. The readings we were getting...
Excuse me, we will get to that, please. We only have a few minutes. Answer my questions. Do they convey a sense of safety and security or a sense of caution?
They convey exactly what they were meant to convey. Okay. Those were the readings we were getting from the scientists.
Do you regret your repeated assurances the air was safe to breathe?
I do not regret repeating what the scientists said was appropriate.
Mr. Henshaw, do these words and phrases convey a sense of danger or even of caution, or do they convey a sense of safety and security, in your opinion?
Again, not counting the pile. The pile was a separate...
We'll get to the pile.
All right. We sampled. We took 240 samples.
Please, answer the question.
All of our samples were significantly below our permissible exposure limit.
You said that already. It's on the record. I just asked you if this conveyed a sense of...
That conveys that the environment is safe.
Okay, thank you. Do you now regret saying it was safe for New Yorkers to go back to work 6 days after the terrorist attack? Is that a mistake?
Not within the financial district. On the pile was a different circumstance. Sir, I do not regret that.
But in the area around it was okay?
All of our data indicated that it was okay.
Ms. Whitman, during 2001, did any government official or outside scientist tell you that EPA statements were not adequately communicating health risk warnings based on the data available at the time?
Mr. Chairman, to the best of my knowledge, no one of the scientists who were responsible for analyzing the data on the pile ever indicated...
Did any scientist...
Not that I can recall.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ms. Whitman, I'd like to talk about the information you had or didn't have at the time and compare it to what EPA said publicly. Much of this information is contained on that chart to your left, although not all of it. It is document 16 in the binder that was supplied to you, since I know it's a little difficult to read that, because I can't read it from here. That chart summarizes overwhelming evidence that when the EPA was assuring everyone that the air was safe, in fact, it either didn't have supporting data or it had data showing the opposite. Ms. Whitman, on September 13th, you said in an interview, everything we're getting back from the sampling that we're doing is below background levels. There is not a reason for the general public to be concerned, close quote. And yet, on September 12th, the day before that statement, in response to an urgent White House inquiry, Dr. Ed Kilbourne of the Centers for Disease Control warned that EPA sampling data was, quote, scanty, unquote, that he was, quote, aware of other toxic hazards in the area about which EPA hasn't asked, and that of the first 5 EPA bulk samples from the World Trade Center site, 1 contained a, quote, substantial of, close quote. That is 20% of the available samples. Doesn't this information make your September 13th statement a flat-out falsehood?
No, it does not, Mr.
Why
Chairman.
doesn't it?
The fact that dust contained high levels of lead and asbestos or asbestos, I should say, was absolutely accurate and true, but that was different than what we were finding in the air. In fact, that was why we were working with the city to put HEPA trucks on the street to get in to suck up the dust and to wash down the outsides of the buildings.
But were you aware
that
Dr. Kilbourne had warned that EPA wasn't asking about lots of toxic hazards, and that he said that the EPA sampling data was scanty and should not be relied upon for safety at that purpose?
I was not aware of any scientists on what happened. Let me describe for you the process. Perhaps it will help things. The first week or 2 weeks, actually, we had 3 phone calls a day, gradually went down to 2 and then 1, that involved every regional administrator from around the country, Region 2, scientists at Region 2, on-scene coordinators, as well as headquarters staff who were involved with emergency response and in communications. We would go over what the samples they were getting in those days, and we were constantly adding to the samples. There's no question about that. We were getting results on a lot of those samples. We'd go over. I'd ask what was accurate to say to the public, what they could hear, what I could say accurately, and I was told went over that, we decided what it was, and we went out and conveyed that to the public.
EPA did not begin regular outdoor air monitoring in Lower Manhattan until September 14th. The only air monitoring results, we're told, that you had for September 12th and 13th were from the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Those air samples, of the 10 air samples the city took during those days, 7 showed asbestos levels above the EPA's 1% trigger mark, including one from as far as 6 blocks away of the municipal building. Yet, the September 13th press release states that EPA, quote, found either no asbestos or very low levels of asbestos, and further states that monitoring and sampling have been very reassuring about potential exposure. The general public should be very reassured. This despite the New York City findings of 70% of its samples showing asbestos levels above the EPA's 1% trigger level. Isn't this a little contradictory?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to try to go back almost 6 years now to second-guess the scientists at the time, but I will tell you...
Excuse me, it's not second-guessing the scientists at the time.
It would be second-guessing the scientists.
No,
Mr. Chairman.
my question had nothing to do with the scientists. My question had to do with the fact that you're putting out very reassuring statements saying nobody's finding any asbestos levels above any high asbestos levels. Well, in fact, the only test that they had at that time, the New York City test, showed high asbestos levels above the 1% mark in 70% of the tests. 2 things there, Mr. Chairman, and I cannot determine based on the question what's in play here, whether all of the samples that you're talking about from New York City were related to the dust or related to the air. Those were 2 different things. Those were air. Those were air samples.
All right, fine, thank you. I also will tell you that it was my understanding we had people back on the site. We did use New York City samples. We used New York State samples. We used samples, as I mentioned, from over 17 different organizations, and we were taking our own samples. Which we were taking at which time, I can't tell you. I can't go back and tell you.
Let's go into your own samples. The EPA dust samples of September 14th show asbestos levels of 2.1 to 3.3%, which is 210% and 330% above the EPA's 1% trigger level. Yet, the EPA's September 16th press release describes this as slightly above the 1% trigger. Don't you believe that characterizing dust samples that are 210 to 330% above your own standard as only slightly above the trigger is falsely reassuring and misleading?
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I can't imagine that we would have released a statement 3 days later that wasn't based on new testing data and results, because we were getting new information every single day when I was on the phone.
But the fact is that you did release that statement, test results that were there at the time.
Oh, if we're talking about dust or air, again, there was a difference between dust and air.
These were dust samples.
And the second, you're saying that the second statement related to dust samples too, or air samples?
The second statement simply said that, yes, they referred to these specific tests